Chapter 17. Closed for business. Mid-afternoon, and the Double Deuce was closed, the staff inside setting up for the night. Dalton had heard back from his supplier contact over in Springfield, who had told Tillman to expect a delivery of booze today. Dalton wanted to be there when it arrived. He wasn't sure why, but something about the way he told his boss that he'd take care of it had left him wanting to make sure it all went as planned. He took his jacket off as he entered the bar, returned the greetings he got from everyone in the room, and headed over to sit by Cody on the stage. "Hey, Cody," he called out to let him know he was coming. The blind singer had been tuning his guitar, by ear, of course. "Hey, bro, what's going down?" he asked, setting the instrument across his lap. "Not too much," Dalton answered, keeping it light. "That's not what I hear," Cody said seriously. "The word is, you've been spending time with Elizabeth Clay." "So?" asked Dalton. "You know who had a thing for Elizabeth Clay?" Cody paused for effect. "Brad Wesley." This couldn't be all about a woman, Dalton thought. Well, it could be, he reminded himself. He knew firsthand the lengths a jilted lover might go for their honor, and the length you might have to go in order to stop them from taking your life in some stupid attempt to restore it. He remembered the blood on his hands and the body at his feet. But Dalton thought that Wesley didn't seem the type to let emotion rule his decision-making, though he realized he'd concluded this based on the one conversation they'd actually had. He stayed quiet and let Cody go on. "As I hear it, she left town and he went nuts," the singer said. "It's a small town, huh, Dalton?" Dalton quietly reflected that it was, and that was exactly what he hated about small towns. He'd not worked in one yet that wasn't an incestuous hive of self-involved activity, everybody related to everybody else and everybody knowing your business, or trying to at least. His moment of reflection was interrupted by a shout from across the club.
"Dalton!"
It was Hank.
"The truck's here."
"Okay," Dalton told him. Cody had heard the concern, for the information about the dock, not the news about the truck, in his friend's voice. He was more attuned to the sound of emotion than most. "Of course, that's just the word." He tried to console the cooler, reaching out to find his shoulder and giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Thanks," said Dalton, returning the gesture as he grabbed his jacket and headed towards the back door. "No problem," said Cody, going back to tuning the guitar and wondering whether he should have said something or not. From what he knew about Dalton, he felt he'd done the right thing. Dalton watched the big white Ford truck pull up to the loading ramp at the back of the club. He was happy to see that he knew the delivery driver. "Hey, Jim," he greeted him as he jumped down from the cab. "Dalton!" the little man returned with a smile, taking off his cap and running a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. Dalton saw patches of damp on his grey shirt too, and thought about how hot it must get in the cab on a day like this. "Long time no see." "Is seeing me a good thing?" Dalton asked. "Well, yes," said the driver, then paused as if remembering something. "As long as I don't piss you off," he laughed. Dalton glanced up at the cab. "You alone?" "Yep," said Jim. "None of the others felt like making the trip." "Can't find the help, huh?" "Nope." "You need a hand?" Dalton asked him, laying his jacket down on the side of the ramp. "Nope again," Jim replied. "That'd be my job. Only got the one trolley anyway." Dalton helped him roll up the truck's shutter and pull out the trolley all the same, but when he started to lift some boxes of whiskey, the old man looked at him as if to ask, "Now what did I just say?" So Dalton smiled and headed away towards the club's back door. He decided to stay outside, preferring his own company for now. Jim wasn't exactly a great conversationalist, so he figured he'd be safe out here, taking in the sun's rays, to peacefully think on what Cody had told him. The delivery driver had barely started filling the trolley for a second run when Dalton heard a vehicle driving towards them. There was nothing but a dusty access lane back here, so he knew it would be coming this way. He looked over from where he was leaning against the thick wooden post to see a pickup truck pulling up. 2 men in the cab and 2 more sat in the bed. They all piled out, and Dalton sighed, knowing he wasn't about to get that peace after all. The 4 men bypassed Dalton at first, walking straight up onto the ramp and over to the open back of the delivery truck. Dalton looked like he was ignoring them too, but he took their measure, assessing the threat. Leading the way was O'Connor, with Tinker bringing up the rear. The first of the new additions to Wesley's goon squad was Morgan, the Double Deuce's famously quick-to-anger ex-bouncer. Turned out he'd found a new job after all. The final member of the quartet was a mountain of a man, a head taller than O'Connor, and Dalton considered O'Connor tall. He'll have to go first, Dalton thought, staring at his knees. "Hey, put 'em back," said O'Connor aggressively, stopping the delivery driver's loaded trolley of Tia Maria and Drambuie with his boot. "This bar is closed for business." "It's okay, Jim. Take a break," Dalton told the confused-looking driver. Jim looked at the men, then back at Dalton, as if to say, "Are you sure?" Dalton smiled and nodded, and Jim headed inside. Morgan ripped open the cardboard box of Drambuie from the top of the trolley and pulled out a bottle. Dalton watched him staring at it as if he'd never seen one before. The whiskey liqueur wasn't exactly top-of-the-top-shelf stuff, but Dalton had Morgan pegged as the kind of guy to ask a bartender, "What's cheap?" "Can I buy you guys a drink?" he offered. Morgan stared at him as if he'd never been so offended in his life. Dalton was about to add, "As friends, of course," but Morgan replied to his offer by smashing the bottle down angrily on the floor. "Guess not," said Dalton dryly, knowing that the pleasantries were done with. His plan to go after the mountain first was thwarted, as the big man was the furthest away from him, he and Morgan busily smashing as many bottles of booze onto the concrete ramp as they could. Seeing as Tinker was the nearest, and heaviest, Dalton went after him first, a side kick to the gut driving him backward, before he parried O'Connor's first punch and retaliated with one of his own. For a moment, he felt in control, as Morgan turned from his bottle breaking, thankfully with empty hands, and joined in too. Dalton managed to catch him with a kick before he got in grappling range, then turned back to the others, who seemed to be coming at him, helpfully, one at a time. It was then that he felt a huge pair of arms wrap around him from behind and lift him physically off the floor. He tried to brace down and kick back, only to realize that his feet were dangling a good foot from the concrete. It was then that Dalton thought that he might need some help. Wade Garrett had seen 100 towns like this, 1,000. He drove down the main street of Jasper on his Harley chopper, enjoying the wind in his long hair. Garrett never wore a helmet, being the kind of guy who thought that when your time was up, you just had to accept it. Say a final prayer and vaya con Dios. Unless your end was coming at you in the form of someone you could fight, of course. Then it was game on. He saw the club at the edge of the town, knowing he was in the right place from the big, new sign on the front of the roof. It wasn't lit up right now, but he imagined it made a pretty sight all glowing at night. Still, you can't polish a turd, he thought. If he'd seen one dive bar, he'd seen them all. Well, he'd seen a good few anyway. He'd stopped counting after the 50th place he'd bounced in, having worked half of the states in the Union by then too. Counting after that had lost its charm, and it had all been a blur since then anyway. Over 25 years in the business, and he didn't have much to show for it, apart from quite a few scars, and a pain-in-the-ass limp. Garrett pulled up near the entrance of the Double Deuce, dropped the kickstand on his chopper, and turned off the growling engine. As he climbed off the bike, saddle sore from the road, he sighed and looked up at the sign again. The Double Douche, he grumbled to himself, nobody else around to laugh at the joke. Kid, what have you got yourself into now? Inside he found the club in better repair than he expected. There wasn't literal spit and sawdust on the floor at least. Like the outside, he figured the interior had recently had a new lick of paint. He wondered how long it would stay clean. He walked over to the bar and took off his shades, throwing them down on the counter. You got a skinny little runt named Dalton working here? He asked. There were 4 men behind the bar, working at one thing or another, and they all turned to him at that. Which was the idea. He's out back, the nearest man replied after a moment's pause. Then another one, the club's owner, Garrett figured, given that he was the oldest and wearing a white shirt, whilst the others were in uniform red tees, came over. I know you, he said. Garrett was a little proud that his legend still preceded him. He had that to show for all the years of work at least, and he wondered what it was worth here. Pour me a beer, will you? He said, knocking a cigarette out of his pack and limping to a nearby door. I'll be back. His plan had been to join the kid for a quick smoke and a catch-up, but he could tell that wasn't going to be the way of it as he approached the loading ramp and heard aggressive laughing, mixed in with pained grunts. 2 big men had Dalton held by his arms to a post. Another with shaggy hair and a beard was laying punches into his gut. Garrett took stock of the situation for a moment, noting a 4th man, the kind who ironically gets nicknamed Tiny, busily smashing bottles of booze nearby. The man had to be pushing 7 feet tall, and yet he had blood coming from his nose. Garrett figured the kid had to be responsible for that. He was surprised Dalton could jump that high. How's it going, mijo? He asked his old friend, as if they'd just bumped into each other during a stroll in the park. The one doing the punching paused, his face a mixture of anger and confusion, before he said gruffly, Mind your own business, Dad. Then he went back to wailing on Dalton. Garrett knew he was getting on a bit, his hair and stubble now more grey than black, but he didn't figure he looked old enough to be dismissed so easily. Still, sometimes appearing more helpless than you are has its advantages, and sometimes a dad has to hand out a whooping when the kids get too rowdy. He walked over to the tall one, having to look up to stare him in the eye. Do you want to fight, dickless? The mountain asked. Well, I sure ain't gonna show you my dick, Garrett said, before turning his head as if to walk away. Then he came back in with a quick right hand. Garrett had often heard it said that a man should fight fair. He always thought that it was best that you fight to win. Fair had nothing to do with it, so his punch landed right in the other man's balls. The mountain doubled over with the pain, covering up his groin, but Garrett knew it wouldn't be long until he came up in a rage. He wasn't waiting around for that. Balancing on his bad leg, he drove his strong leg down into the side of his opponent's knee, then watched him tumble to the ground, giving out an agonized, "Ah, shit!" on the way down. Garrett leaned over the crippled man, grinning as he ran his hand through his hair and speaking from experience. God damn, that hurts, doesn't it? Tinker had seen all of this and thought it was time to do something about the new threat. He let go of Dalton's arm and started running at Garrett, surprisingly fast for a man of his girth. But the old cooler turned in time to see him coming, quickly stopping his advance with a sharp left straight to the jaw, then pushing him right off the loading ramp while he was still stunned. O'Connor came at him next. A left to the body took the wind out of that one's sails, and then Morgan flew in too. Relying on a solid fight IQ and a sense of timing he'd developed over the years, Garrett managed to alternate between throwing hands at the pair of them while glancing over at Dalton, sagging against the post between shots, and thinking, "Come on, kid, you've got to do some of the work here." He hit Morgan with a big right that caused him to go down, buying him time to concentrate on O'Connor. The thug raised up his hands in a boxing stance, like they were about to hear a bell. Garrett decided to show him some boxing. He landed a quick jab to the other man's jaw and followed it with an overhand right that sent his opponent spinning. No bell to speak of, but his head would be ringing for a while. O'Connor toppled off the loading ramp and into an open dumpster below. When Garrett turned to see what surprises the last man had for him, he saw that the kid had finally regained his senses and was now returning the favour from earlier, his fists slamming into the big curly-haired thug. The man got spun around from one of Dalton's quick right hooks, sending him almost tumbling into Garrett, who spun him back with a right of his own. The kid grabbed him by the collar, looking like he was about to smash his head into his opponent's face. But Garrett could see he was out on his feet, and then Dalton did too, releasing the man and watching him collapse on his back with a thud, dirt kicking up all around him. As soon as the last of the thugs hit the deck, Garrett watched as a squad of red t-shirted bouncers, followed by a gaggle of onlookers, came tumbling out of the door to support them, someone shouting, "There's a fight out back!" from inside. They were too late to help. Ain't that always the way of it, thought Garrett. Dalton took a moment or two to regain his breath, then headed over to his old mentor. "Hey, I had it under control," he said with a smile. "Yep, I knew that," Garrett laughed, shaking his hand. "Glad to see you," Dalton chuckled, and the two old friends embraced. "Good to see you," Garrett agreed. "Who is that guy?" someone asked from the gathered crowd. "Gentlemen," said Cody, who'd been guided to the scene by Carrie Ann. "Wade Garrett." "Holy shit," whispered Hank, who considered himself somewhat a collector of stories about the legends of the profession, and was annoyed with himself that he hadn't recognized this one sooner. Garrett looked at his audience, a big grin on his face. "Exactly right,"